Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Newseum's Night TV studio in this very special edition of Inside Media. My name is John Maynard. Excuse me. I am program director here at the Newseum. Well, of course, as you all know, we suffered a great loss this week with the death of Gwen Ifill, one of the country's most prominent journalists. Gwen was the anchor and managing editor of PBS NewsHour and Washington Week. She was an author, moderated 2 vice presidential debates, and worked at the Washington Post, New York Times, and NBC News. She was a friend, mentor, and colleague to so many in both the Washington, D.C. community and beyond, and she was a great friend of the Newseum. She was awarded the Al Newharth Award for Excellence in Media in 2013, and personally speaking, as program director, it was always such a personal delight to work with her. She appeared on and moderated many programs here, running the gamut from politics to civil rights to the future of journalism. And I can tell you she was our top pick to moderate a program with Jon Stewart a couple of years ago, and boy, was that a lot of fun. I only unfortunately knew Gwen from working with her at these events at the Newseum, but we are blessed and honored today to be joined by a distinguished panel who knew Gwen so much more closely during her illustrious career. I'll just go down the line here and offer only the briefest of bios for each of our panelists, although I could spend a lot of time going through their careers. Kevin Merida is a senior vice president at ESPN and editor-in-chief of ESPN's website, The Undefeated, which focuses on sports, race, and culture. Kevin is a former managing editor of the Washington Post, where he had worked for over 20 years. Sonya Ross is the race and ethnicity editor at the Associated Press and has spent her entire career with the Wire service, starting as a general assignment reporter in 1987, before moving to Washington, where she's covered so many things, including urban affairs, Congress, and the White House. Karen Tumulty is a national correspondent with the Washington Post, where she's worked since 2010. Prior to the Post, she held that same title at Time magazine, where she wrote more than a dozen cover stories. She also spent 14 years at the Los Angeles Times. And finally, Pete Williams is an NBC News correspondent based in Washington and has been covering the Justice Department and the Supreme Court since 1993. Prior to joining NBC, Pete served as a press official on Capitol Hill for many years and was Pentagon spokesman in the George H.W. Bush administration. So please welcome our distinguished panel. So I thought I'd start by just sort of going down the line, starting with you, Kevin, and tell us how you first got to know Gwen, and I think you've probably known her the longest.
Well, we both went to college in Boston, and she graduated from Simmons College in 1977. I graduated from Boston University in 1979, and somewhere, I guess it was like 78, and a few of us started this kind of ragtag alternative student newspaper. The newspaper was called Black Folk. I'm not sure how we came up with that name. Looking back on it, if I was naming it, but and so we put this newspaper out, and it was a time of student publications, and so we had done this piece about black journalists in Boston, and here was this young person. We interviewed Gwen, and there was another, Lonnie Bisabel. There was not a great number of them, and what struck us about Gwen was that we had, discovered here was this young black woman who was working at the Boston Herald American right out of college. And at the time, in the post-Watergate era, the journalism was such a flourishing industry. And to see this young black woman get this job, and knowing the tension in Boston, we all felt that, and it was a very troubled time. And here was she, this very cool, it seemed, elegant and in composure, and complete compose as such a young journalist. And it was just, a marvel. She encountered, as has been told many times during the tribute, in their newsroom, colleague leaving a note and people calling it an N-word. But it was, she started her career then, and we got to know each other much better later.
All right.
Can I just interrupt,
Pete, sure.
Just to add to that? The way Gwen tells the story, she came to work one day and there was a note in her locker that said, N-word, go home. And her first response was, I wonder who this is for.
Yeah, that's how she would handle that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Sonya, tell us when you first met Gwen.
I'll tell you where I first met Gwen, and then I'll tell you where I could have met Gwen.
Okay, all right.
Which I think is interesting.
I like this. Yeah.
I first met Gwen at the northwest gate of the White House. How appropriate a place is that? I was very new to Washington. I had been here probably less than a year, and I was covering a news conference at the Press Club. And back in those days, there was always a news conference at the Press Club that every reporter had to be at, pre-internet. You know, and it was a beautiful day, so I decided to walk back to the bureau from the Press Club, and our bureau at the time was located at 20th and K Streets. So I was taking this diagonal stroll across Washington and reveling in the fact that, ooh, I'm here, look at this. And as I came around the Treasury Department and cutting across in front of the White House, I saw Gwen Ifill standing at the Northwest Gate entrance there, talking to a colleague on the street. So I was trying to slow walk, fast walk up, so in case she walked away before I got there. And I went up to her and introduced myself and told her how I had admired her work and that I was so proud that she was at the White House. And she thanked me. She said, and thank you so much, and you can do this, you know. I never even said I wanted to do it, because at the time I didn't even know I wanted to do anything that intense. I always thought the White House was reserved for, you know, really big time journalists, not somebody like myself. So I said, oh, you know, I didn't know what else to say to that. Oh, and hilariously went to church the following Sunday, and there's Gwen on the pew. Okay. Now, I had been referred to this church by my pastor in Atlanta. Before I moved to Washington, I got to Washington, and there's Gwen Ifill on the pew of the church. And I said, see, if I had not been so young and random and skipping church, because I had been out on Saturday night enjoying my life in my new city, I probably would have met Gwen sooner than I did at the Northwest Gate of the White House.
Right. Good story. Karen.
I first met Gwen almost 30 years ago now in the 1988 Jesse Jackson campaign. She and I were both young reporters. She worked for the Washington Post, which is where I work now, and I was at the LA Times. And the Jackson campaign was kind of hardship duty for young reporters. He ran such a hard campaign, and it was not all that unusual for him to do a 24-hour day. He would start on the East Coast, hop the time zones, and do a rally at the end on the West Coast. And Gwen was, even then, as a very young reporter, it was just striking how grounded and assured and how much of a real presence she already was. And so we became great friends, and for the rest of our lives have sort of shared both this craft of ours and also, you know, all the changes you go through in life. But in the recent years, we were at some presidential debate or some event, and it suddenly occurred to us that we'd gone from being the youngest people in the room to the oldest. And so we privately began calling each other Jack and Jules, because we reminded ourselves, we were the cranky old people who reminded ourselves of Jack Germond and Jules Whitcover when we were younger. But I just can't even imagine what it's going to be like to go to these events and to even share as much as we've shared in our lives, you know, without Gwen here.
Go ahead, Pete, NBC.
Well, I met Gwen in 1994 when she came to NBC News. It was something she had to be talked into, threatened to do almost, by our dearly departed bureau chief, Tim Russert, who was the moderator of Meet the Press. I see Margie Larriman, who was the deputy bureau chief at the time, right down the hall from where Gwen had her office at NBC News on Nebraska Avenue. She was skeptical about leaving the world of newspapering, and remember, she'd worked at the Washington Post and she'd been at the New York Times, and she was a little curious about this thing called television, and she was fearful that it might not be serious enough and substantive enough. And Tim finally said, "What are you afraid of?" And she came to NBC. She took to it very quickly. I've always said she disputes that and said that she had an adjustment period. But she quickly learned how important the people behind the camera were, and she said, I flirted terribly with the photographers, and it worked out to my benefit. Now, she tells a story that I assume is apocryphal, that on one of her first assignments at Capitol Hill, she was assigned to go cover a hearing, and she went and she came back with her notes and started to write it, and they said, "Well, where's the video? Where are the pictures?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I forgot about that." But that didn't last long, and she took to television very quickly because, of course, she's such a phenomenal reporter.
I was going to, and I'll start with you, Pete, and anyone can chip in, but how do you think her years at the Washington Post and the New York Times really kind of influenced her doing television, both at NBC and PBS?
Well, I think first of all, she had honed her skills as a reporter. She started covering City Hall in Baltimore. She knew politics from the ground up. I think that's one thing. Secondly, she understood sort of what goes on in the background, and that what might have happened behind the scenes that led to an announcement or a decision. So she had that. She knew how Washington worked. She knew how the machinery worked, and that was a tremendous advantage.
I think, too, that one thing that made her unique, at least in my experience of being around television people, is Gwen was almost allergic to punditry.
Strike almost.
She, and it's one of the things, too, that is very, very different about Washington Week than any other show. You don't sit at Gwen's table unless you have actually been out reporting that story that you are there to talk about. And that's very, very different from, the cable news networks. You know, you may get booked and you think you're coming on to talk about a budget bill, and then they'll go 10 minutes before air. Can you talk about Benghazi? And that wasn't what Gwen was all about at all. And she also demanded that there be no interrupting on the show, that people be respectful of each other. And beyond that, if you were in the green room getting your makeup done or whatever, she had an iron rule that you could not discuss the story with whoever was there. You couldn't gossip about it because she was just deathly afraid that we were going to leave it in the locker room.
Sonya, how would you describe her as a journalist? When I've been watching some of the PBS NewsHour tribute to her, and one thing I keep hearing is that she was able to cut through the baloney. So what do you think made her so unique?
Gwen was an avid reader and would read things that a lot of us don't really want to read. I mean, she would get deep into policy briefings and wonky stuff. And I always, you know how you said Gwen's allergic to punditry? I'm allergic to wonky stuff. Like I'm not big on getting that deep with the way we navel gaze and analyze in Washington. I sort of feel that's a way to keep your brain clean. Well, Gwen liked to stuff her brain full of information and only would let certain parts of it out when it was time to use it. She did not take her vast intellect and flog people about the head and shoulders with it to make you feel stupid or anything like that. Gwen invited me to Washington Week in 2000 after President Clinton's Africa tour, where he was really hoping to sort of preside over a peace agreement in the Great Lakes region of Africa. And so Gwen called and said, "Do you want to be on the show? I need you to talk about that." And I said, "Okay." And then I was reading like frantically. I was like, "Oh my goodness, where's that crazy Sandy Berger briefing that they sent us in the email I got to prepare my brain because I don't want to be on Gwen's show unprepared." She made you read even if you weren't inclined to do a lot of that.
Right.
So.
Well, there's another thing, and I've been thinking about it in this moment that we're in, is it's just the way to ask questions. I think there is a way to be skeptical, and she said that, and others have made that, and not cynical, and to try to get at answers, to really not ask questions so that the question is about the questioner, where you're trying to prove that you're going to be tough on somebody by how you ask the question, how you load it up. Right. And I think she really was, she was about an honest pursuit of the truth, and I think that's the hallmark of journalism. What's needed now is that you're really actually trying to get at the truth. You're not trying to put people in boxes and camps, and she was not one that was wanted to be put in a box herself. Right. But she didn't want that for everybody, right? She didn't want to like, we already know the answer, and now we just have to get this question to show that we're going to be tough on this particular figure. And I think that's a really great trait.
John, go ahead, please.
The other thing though is we're making her sound very sober and earnest, which she was, but
now and then.
but she could also, and one of the great joys of just being around her, whether it was a personal setting or a professional one, is that there was no situation that Gwen couldn't find something to laugh about in. And there's a difference also between laughing about and laughing at. And with Gwen, you were always laughing about.
Well, I was just going to say, here it is a Sunday, and this place is jammed with people wanting to hear about Gwen Ifill. And why is that? Because let's face it, there's a lot of really great reporters in Washington. You see 3 of them here on the table. So what is it about Gwen that was different, that seemed to reach out to people and that has brought you all here on a Sunday? And I think a couple of things come to mind about that. One is, let's face the obvious fact that Gwen was a black woman anchoring an evening news broadcast. Gwen was something of a pioneer. She was something of a role model. So that has to be said. Secondly, there was a grace, and I think that's an appropriate word to use on a Sunday, about Gwen. And a dignity. She loved politics, but she also deeply respected people who engaged in it, who were willing to get into the fray. And she deeply respected the people who cover politics. She took it very seriously. It wasn't just something to cover, something interesting. It was something that she cared about. This was a woman who came to her craft. Her parents were both immigrants from Barbados and Panama. And she grew up, she was, as she would often say, a preacher's kid. She moved around a lot. She saw a lot of America that many people who cover politics in Washington don't see. So she had that grounding. And all of that came through when she was on television. We've all been asked, what's Gwen really like? She's really like what you saw. She was friendly, curious, but I keep coming back to this word respectful.
Yeah. I was going to ask, Pete started it off, but tell us what she was like outside the newsroom. What you saw was what you got, I guess. But what
well, she, there is and we know in Washington, the circles that we travel in, the degree to which a lot of people who they love self-importance as much as importance, and she was not one of those people. Right. No matter wherever she was about the event. She also cared about you. She was. It's so many things where I barely remember her standing out because she was just among us. She's been to our son's graduation party. She's been to people's weddings. And there was never attention called to her. When I left the Post, she was at my going away party, dancing like everybody else. She was regular in the best sense of the word. She had not actually changed in the 38 years I knew her. Right. I saw no discernible change, despite that for most of our peers and people in our, people have had success, but she had outsized success in some of the ways that Pete mentions. And no matter how much fame she got moderating debates, the greater she became, it didn't really change her. And sometimes she would joke. She made time for people. I remember her joking a couple of times, and I would say, we go to the National Association of Black Journalists Convention, and I think for some of us, it's a little bit of a reunion of, you see these people once a year, And Gwen liked to go and be part of it, in part because there was another young group coming up, and she knew how important it was to them to be able to interact with. But she'd always joke, it's like, I'm not going this year, it's like, because I just don't have the stamina. I get stopped in the hall every 5 minutes, you know, these kids want to talk to me. And it was kind of a joke, even though she did make herself available. And she was able to laugh at her stature, but never embrace it in a way that it made her change.
Can I just say, because we can talk about it now, and we haven't been able to talk about it all year, I also learned a lot in how Gwen handled this last almost year of illness. When she told you, it was under very clear orders that you were not to tell people, that she wanted everything, that she was going to not want to be treated any differently. She was going to barrel through this presidential campaign. She was going to fight this with everything she had, and she was going to do this her own way. And but the other thing she told me when she was telling me was that it was hard on her, because being a person of some public stature, she said, every time I tell somebody, it's like being diagnosed all over again, because then I have to deal with their reaction. And the next thing I know, and she said, I just don't want this. I want people to know me for my work. I want people to know me for all the things they've always known me for. And I'm going to handle this as best I can. And she did. I mean, she managed a Democratic debate. When I moderated another Democratic debate, she was picking out my clothes for me. She was helping me with the questions. She anchored all the presidential debates for NewsHour, and that was just weeks ago. It was just, extraordinary that she was able to sort of hold it together. And for those of us who knew what was going on behind the scenes, it was awe-inspiring.
And if I could just take what Kevin said and what Karen just said and put them together and just make one other point. I think one of the reasons Gwen did not want her illness widely known is she didn't want it to be about her. She wanted her reporting to be about her reporting. She didn't want this to be, she didn't want to become the story. And, that's very rare. She had a great perspective. It's not about her, it's about the news.
I've known Gwen Ifill since 1993. Never once have I known what kind of car she drove. Not once. I mean, do you know what kind of car she had? I don't know what kind of car she drove.
She used to drive me home from Washington Week so we could stop and have a drink and gossip about everything that had happened.
I don't know what kind of car she drove. At her house on New Year's Day this year, we were talking about a whole array of things like people talk about, and she had a new outfit on. And she said, don't you like it? Isn't it cute? Don't you think this is cute? Isn't this cute? I don't know where she got it from. Some people will say, I was shopping in Macy's and they had a sale. But she didn't dwell on minutia that way. I called Gwen. Gwen initiated in sorority founded for African American women, Delta Sigma Theta sorority. I'm a member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, which was the first sorority for Black women, and there's this casual teasing rivalry between these two groups. So when Gwen initiated in Delta Sigma Theta, I called to congratulate her, and these two organizations belong to an overarching group called the Divine Nine. And I said, congratulations, my D9 sister. And she said, thank you. And I said, but you were supposed to choose the better sorority. And it was a joke. And she said, I was? Like, oh no, did I make a... Yeah. And I had to explain to her the tradition of joking about this kind of thing. Right. It just was not in her DNA to get involved in things that she thought might be too small to care about. Right. So her friends knowing what kind of car she drove, She didn't care. I mean, did she actually tell you what kind of car she had?
It was a Lexus.
But she would. You found it out from seeing the Lexus, correct?
It was a nice Lexus.
That's a nice
And that bigness about her is something I so admired and want to emulate. I have to pull myself back and say, am I being too small here if I say things this way or that way? Right. I pull on that, draw on that from Gwen.
Before we get to some audience questions, I know we'd love to hear from the audience. I would like to show a short 2-minute clip of Gwen here at the Newseum just a couple months ago. It was late September. She was here for a Walter Cronkite celebration. It was his 100th birthday. So in this clip, she talks a bit about Cronkite, but also some of her thoughts on the future of journalism. So if you could play that clip, Chris, that'd be great.
What you see as your responsibilities and the values that you try to adhere to?
Imagine my shock and surprise and pleasure with the first time I met Walter Cronkite, to have him actually with acknowledge that he watched me on the news every night, and which of course scared the hell out of me, because all of a sudden you realized it was a standard that you were trying to meet. But here's the thing. So many of us in our business are attempting to achieve that level of trust. And what we know to be true about our business right now, television and newspapers and radio and blogs and all the things we are, is that we're not there anymore. That nobody looks at any one of us and says, you, whatever that comes out of your mouth, that I trust. But the best of us are striving for that every single night. And we're striving for it with Walter Cronkite's face in our heads, with the idea, not that we're ever going to be at the place where if we say it, you believe it instantly, but the fact that if we say it, it's because it's backed up, because it's reported. It's not just my opinion. It's not just my bright, clever witticism. We are asking questions for a reason. You know, we laughed a little bit about the debates a moment ago, but the reason why the debates are important and why it's important who's on that stage asking those questions is not because of the personalities asking the questions, it's because of the answers that they elicit from the candidates. And whenever we get caught up talking about what the questions are, we forget that the reason why Walter Cronkite turned conversations with him on the street into interviews is because that was his way of reporting. That was his way of getting to know more. And if people came to him and approached him and said, you know, I know you from the dinosaur show, that was his opportunity to talk to someone who he otherwise would not have met. It's the opportunity we all kind of have to take, especially those of us who are at the wonderful chain to the anchor desk and get out a lot less often to talk to folks than we otherwise would. The salvation for the news business, I've had the beauty of being on this stage many times to talk about different news moments in our history. And the salvation for the news business is that we try to be more like that and not less like that. There's, as you know, an entire swath of the news business which doesn't understand what that means, which doesn't understand that telling a story and who tells the story and what voices you hear and the kinds of voices you hear is as important as what comes out of the anchor's mouth or comes out of the reporter's mouth. And my goal, you know, I'm involved with a group called the News Literacy Project, which is going into high schools and trying to train young people on what to hear or what to believe. And I think that that's our goal for the next generation, not only of journalists, but also of news consumers. We're getting their information from so many places. And I think Walter would be proud of that approach to how we cover the news.
Gwen
Scott,
agreed.
you were a young CBS correspondent after
You can cut it out,
Walter
Chris.
left the anchor desk.
I want to note that Gwen agreed to be on this panel earlier in the summer, and that was on September 29th, which was her birthday. So that was such a great thing to have her that day. I want to get some thoughts before open up to questions, but what was her look ahead at the future of journalism? As you can see, she's optimistic, would you say?
Well, she and Walter Cronkite had a lot in common, one of which is Walter Cronkite started in newspapering and worked for many years for United Press before he went into television, radio and television, and Gwen had that grounding as well. You know, I think Gwen Ifill was a person that people say Walter was the most trusted man in America. I think Gwen was trusted as well. And because of that genuineness that she had, and because, as Karen has pointed out, she was not a bloviator, she was not a pundit. She hated that word, and she hated punditry and uninformed analysis, that kind of thing. And I think that Gwen earned that trust.
Mm-hmm.
I think she'd look at this challenge we have going forward with the incoming Trump administration and say, okay, let's get to work. We got a lot to do. She'd be ready for it. You know, she'd come into it loaded for bear. At, I think, the incomplete nature of the information that is flowing out there would bug her to the point where she'd say, I'm gonna nail it down and I'm not gonna finish until it's nailed down. So she would have found this very exciting, the times we're in, to be very exciting.
Right, right. Well, let's see if we can get some audience questions. We have two staffers here with microphones. I see a hand up right there. Wendy, if you could get a mic to, why don't you just yell it out, ma'am? Sir? Ma'am? Go ahead. Yep, yep. You.
So, I had the privilege of interviewing Gwen for my book about diversity. And one part that she really resonated with and really said to me that that's what made her, she thought, a really good reporter and a person who can understand the world, was about the concept of what I was calling the elephant and the mouse, which was the notion of what dominant groups members know and what non-dominant group members know, and that dominant group members know much about non-dominant group members, but non-dominant group members know an enormous amount about dominant group members. And she said she had spent basically her entire life, obviously as a non-dominant group person, observing the dominant group, and felt that that's actually perhaps what made her, in many ways, an excellent reporter of what was going on in the world, because she could observe it in a way that was dispassionate rather than just understanding, not understanding this dynamic, but absolutely understanding it. And I just wanted to share that because it really helped me understand how she saw the world.
Any thoughts on? Oh, take it right there.
I'm not quite sure which day she died and how cogent she was near her death. And so my question is, did she know who won the presidency,
She did.
and what was her reaction to that?
She not only knew who won, but one of her friends, and apparently this is quite difficult to do in Washington, D.C., managed to get a ballot to her in the hospital.
Oh, jeez.
So and what she said is, and the seriousness of her situation did not become clear until the absolute end. I mean, Gwen was convinced, and everybody was convinced around her, that she was getting out of that hospital. But she said, there is no way my godchildren are going to be told that I didn't vote in this election.
And Sonya kind of touched on this, but I was wondering what do you think she's going to miss most about covering the new administration? I mean, I know it's a hard question to ask, but yeah.
Well, I think you have to remember that Gwen wrote a book called The Breakthrough and talked a lot about President Obama and other black political figures. So I think one of the things that she would have been watching, that we'll be watching, is to what extent this new administration undoes a lot of the things that the Obama administration put in place. That's going to be a big story for all of us.
You know, in that clip that you showed, John, she mentioned reporting a number of times, and I think that's at the heart of it. I mean, I think, you know, we're in this period where, you know, the media is so diffuse. People are even having a hard time knowing what that word means. And I think, though, I'm going to predict that it's going to whittle away, that reporting is going to become more and more important. I mean, we've had a lot of discussion about fake news lately. And the New York Times had a great dissection of one fake news moment today. And we have a lot of, that's part of the polarization we see and the division we see. But we've also had some tremendous reporting. And I think that at this time to kind of go out and discover your country and learn more about it and to really report stories and bring enlightenment to people is something that she would have welcomed.
Right.
I don't know about anybody else, but I was looking forward to seeing Gwen sit down with President-elect Trump for an interview. I wanted to watch that interview, man. To just see her get inside his head.
Yeah.
I really wanted to see that interview. It sort of makes it abundantly clear to all of us how we have to go out there and grab a piece of that legacy and see if we can do it for her. I wanted that interview. I still want that interview. I can't imagine not having it. It's still very surreal to say, okay, I'm waiting for when they're going to schedule that interview Gwen will have with President-elect Trump.
Well, we have time for just a couple more questions, but I wanted to ask you also, all of you, what issues outside of the newsroom were important to Gwen in her personal life? I mean, obviously she had a passion for politics, but what were some of the issues? What would you talk about just outside the newsroom?
Well,
besides her car.
Yeah, I mean, two things come to mind. Church. I mean, obviously she was in her. There was a wonderful service at Metropolitan AME Church, her church home, and she comes from a family of preachers. The AME Church. My family also was involved in AME Church, so I relate to that. That church, and they named a pew for her, and that was really, I think, she would have, you know, she's looking down, she would have loved that. You know, she's very important. Yesterday, the bishop talked about how much she had contributed to that church and helping to make it run. The other thing, though, I think about her are things like, I remember one time my wife is sitting right here, who is also Donna Britt, a great writer in her own light. I would be her personal flacker here, but during one of Gwen's annual New Year's Day party, there was, as I recall, a discussion about some Broadway musical, and then all of a sudden, and Donna is a big Broadway musical person, and they were going back and forth singing the songs of different Broadway musicals, and Gwen had this kind of encyclopedic knowledge of lyrics of Broadway musicals, which was another part of her.
I think she had tickets to see Hamilton a third time, was it?
Yeah.
The other thing about Gwen, I mean, she was so good at so many things, but she was really, really, really good at friendship. She was always there with, a pat on the back when you needed it. But also, when she just had this sense of when you needed to hear from her and when you needed an attaboy or it isn't that bad.
She was, as a friend of hers said this week, good at being happy. She was she was a person of great joy, and she spread that joy. Just to be around her. I've got a friend who describes certain places in the world as power spots, that you feel better if you're there. Gwen was a power person. You felt better to be in her presence. She loved life, and she loved sharing that joy.
Gwen was goofy. Yeah, I mean, she enjoyed being goofy, Right. You would look at some of the stuff that Gwen would say or Gwen would do, and you think, Gwen, that was really goofy. But she liked that, and yet she made it endearing to be that corny, goofy person who would come with the right amount of corny, goofy affection for you that you just had to give in to it. It was
she was
amazing.
never starstruck by interviewing a president or a senator or a candidate. But let's be honest here, interviewing Smokey Robinson, we heard about it for...
Yeah. Aretha?
Yeah. Oh, she was over the moon about Aretha.
Do you have a question? Yeah.
What did the future hold for Gwen? She, without the illness, she had risen so high, so fast. Where could she go from where she was?
I think she liked where she was. Her career path, I think she found her, she always used to say you should make use of your gifts. And I think she found a place where she could make use of her gifts. They retooled that fusty old program that came on Friday nights on PBS, made it Washington Week with Gwen Ifill, and she retooled it. She made sure that it wasn't a bunch of puffy old white guys sitting around talking, that she reached out to a sort of new generation of reporters and added a lot of diversity to that program. And then she and Judy Woodruff were co-anchoring the NewsHour. And I don't think there's anything else that she wanted to do. I think she would have kept doing that for years to come until she didn't want to do it anymore.
You know, the real question is what would the future have held for us had there been no cancer to take Gwen Ifill away? Because I feel she would have brought all of us to where she was. It wasn't really that there would be anything that would take her to another place. She just rearranged the world and dragged it over to where she was.
We'll go there and then the front.
We all know Gwen was an exceptional journalist, and we've all spoken about all of her gifts in that arena. I interned for Gwen every summer of college from 98 till 2001, just told my age. So I guess I'd like to speak more to the personal side of Gwen, and she used to drive me home from the internship every day in her Lexus, and she would sing songs on the radio and tease me and say, I bet you don't know this song. Oftentimes it would be Motown. She was compassionate in a way that you wouldn't necessarily expect a woman of such strength to be. I remember having a heartbreak and breaking up with my college boyfriend and her sharing, you know, I've had my heart broken too. And I was stunned because to me, she was a giant, and who could break her heart? And I last saw her September 26th, and we were supposed to have gotten together next week over the holidays. But throughout my career, as busy as she was, she would always take the time, to reach back. I remember when I decided to start reporting entertainment news 11 years ago, I was so afraid to tell Gwen that I was going to do it because I thought I was disappointing her. And instead, she encouraged me and she said, you have to do this now while people are asking you to. She said, because when you get to be my age, no one will ask you to do this. So do it now while you can, and you're young enough to always switch sides. And so she was always there, and I didn't know that she monitored things as closely as she did. And anytime a celebrity or anybody that she knew would reach out to me on Twitter, she would respond to them directly and say, that's my girl now, be careful. So I can't say enough wonderful things about her, and I just hope that all of us who were mentored by her can make her proud.
Thank you so much.
You know, I think that's...
Can I just say, given what we just heard from the very wonderful and self-effacing Janelle Snowden, who is a marvelous reporter, and because she had that Gwen Ifill influence, yes, I'm going to rave about your work, because she had that wonderful Gwen Ifill influence on her professional career, she went into this realm of entertainment reporting in a most serious way, and one of the most meaningful pieces of journalism that she's committed is trying to get to the bottom of who really killed Jam Master Jay of the group Run DMC. Mm-hmm. It remains an unsolved murder, but this young journalist here came that close to solving it. And I think that's the true legacy of a Gwen Ifill, because she is able to do what she's doing.
Right. Thank you. I think we are almost out of time, so we'll take one last question.
Okay, just a very quick question. The literacy initiative that she mentioned, I had a good fortune to be on the 29th when she appeared here, not knowing, of course, what was behind all that. But that literary initiative that you talked about, is there anybody taking that forward? Is that going to go forward? Because right now, speaking as a consumer, when I watch on-air personalities now, I only have one other person I can listen to with that same level of authenticity, and he's sitting on the stage.
Thank you.
The News Literacy Project is ongoing. It's run by a fellow named Alan Miller, and it goes into mostly high school levels, I think. And it is ongoing and very active, but I think they're gonna, again, Gwen would throw herself into things like this, and I'm sure they're gonna miss her energy and her talent.
Well, this has been an incredible panel. I want to thank Kevin Merida, Sonya Ross, Karen Tumulty, and Pete Williams. And thank you all for joining us here for remembering Gwen Ifill. Thank you all.